you hear. And I want to also introduce our program director, Jody Vincent, who's in the corner, and our program coordinator, Susanna Morris, is manning the recording equipment. If you have any questions this evening or you're interested in learning more about LitArts, please just see one of us and we're happy to talk to you. I want to start by acknowledging that we're gathered this evening on the ancestral homes of the Narragansett Nation, who had their land stolen through settler colonial violence. We recognize their continued presence as a sovereign nation and multi-millennia long steward of this land. We honor their stories and the vibrant contributions of Indigenous people who live, work, and create in Rhode Island today. Our program, fittingly, this evening is From Manuscripts to Museums, Sharing Indigenous Narratives. And this is a conversation between best-selling author and LitArts Rhode Island member and supporter Vanessa Lillie and Tomaquag Museum Executive Director Lorén. Our mission at LitArts is to build Rhode Island's arts community by supporting the state's creative writers and enriching the lives of readers. Tonight's program is meant to accomplish both of these. We're going to give you the opportunity to hear from two storytellers who work in different but overlapping media and how they navigate the dynamic relationships between history, narratives, truth, and fiction to create their work. And then, thanks to our friends at Heartleaf, you can buy and read their books. And we're also grateful to our friends at Campus Fine Wines for their support of tonight's event. A little bit of housekeeping. Please turn off your cell phones. We are recording tonight's event, so we just wanted to let you know. And very important, the bathroom is over there. So I'm going to introduce you to our two conversationalists. Lorén Spears, enrolled Narragansett Tribal Nation citizen and executive director of Tomaquag Museum, earned her master's in education from the University of Rhode Island and doctor of education from Roger Williams University. An author and artist, she shares her cultural knowledge with the public through museum programs. She's contributed to a variety of publications such as Dawnland Voices, an anthology of Indigenous writing of New England through our eyes, and Indigenous View of Mashpog Pond, and other works. We have several of Loren's books here, if you would like to purchase later. She co-edited a new edition of A Key into the Language of America by Roger Williams, and recently co-authored, As We Have Always Done, Decolonizing the Tomaquag Museum's Collections Management Policy, which was published in Collections, a journal for museum and archive professionals. Under her leadership, Tomaquag Museum received the Institute of Museum and Library Services National Medal in 2016. She has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including induction into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame in 2025. I'm also going to add personally, because I've known her for many years, she is the hardest working woman in Rhode Island, but also one of the things she's working hard at right now is tirelessly raising money to fund a new Tomaquag Museum and Research Center. I do not need to tell anyone in this room how hard it is to fundraise for humanities projects in particular right now. So please consider tonight or at any time making a gift to support the new Tomaquag, which is Rhode Island's only Indigenous-led museum. You're welcome. we have supported one another's work for many years. Vanessa Lillie is the author of USA Today best-selling suspense novel Blood Sisters, which was a Target Book Club pick and a Good Morning America Book Club Buzz pick, as well as being named one of the best mystery novels of 2023 by the Washington Post and Amazon. The sequel, The Bone Thief, which is keeping me up nights, I just was telling Vanessa, was just released last month and has already landed a spot on the USA Today bestseller list. Her other best-selling thrillers are Little Voices and For the Best, and she's the co-author of the Young Rich Widow series. Originally from Oklahoma, Vanessa is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She has 15 years of marketing and communications experience and enjoys organizing book events in and around Providence, where she now lives. She loves connecting with readers and hosts an Instagram live show with crime fiction authors. And I will add, she has been a LitArts Rhode Island member since the organization started in 2018. We are hugely grateful for her support and so proud of her and so delighted by her incredible success. I am now going to stop talking and turn it over to Lorén and Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm an OG member of this incredible organization, and it was so my debut, I think I revised it in the guys like did a little voices by Vanessa Lillie poster, and you had it at the table, and I mean, I will never forget that. It was incredible. I was so excited. And there have been so many other times that you've supported me, but you know, it's just a really incredible organization. And when I try to convince people to move to Rhode Island, because I do that a lot with my friends, I often mention this organization because I'm like, you can go and have co-working space, and it's the coolest. And so we're lucky to have you all, so thank you. So I thought it would be fun if Lorén and I started out with our origin stories, sort of what brought us to this line of work, because we had an event before and I hadn't heard the full story of Lorén, so I think you all might enjoy that too. Mine kind of quickly is that I loved writing as a kid, and then got involved in political science. And it pulled me away from the joy of creative writing. So college was a lot of political science and journalism, which was nice. But by the time I then was in my early 20s, I had this sort of, just sort of a sadness, I would say, because I was not being creative anymore. And I finally identified it and thought, oh my gosh, what if I wrote a novel? And like just that thought felt like lightning. And I realized how much I needed to learn, but, and I was in marketing and communication, so I was doing writing at the time, but I wasn't doing creative writing. So kind of from that moment that I said, you know what, I want to write a book, to when I was actually published my debut, Little Voices, you know, in part thanks to this organization, was 13 years. So I always like to share that, you know, it's so wonderful to be published, but really it's a journey. And even once you are published, the journey continues of ups and downs. But it was so fun to learn how to write a book. And I joined actually Romance Writers of America, and learned craft and structure from them. I ended up writing thrillers, but I'm really grateful to them as an organization. And I, you know, once I met other writers, I assume there's some writers in the audience, you just feel so seen when you're talking to other writers, and it's just a wonderful community. And so, and then from there, you know, I've kind of continued, and this is my 7th book. But it's, you know, the journey along the way and the people has really been kind of the best part. And I'm also want to encourage people that, you know, it is not a easy road or a clean road, but it's a great road, and it's one that is really worth it, ups and downs and all.
I don't remember having this conversation at the last place, so. But I guess my journey has been very roundabout. For those, how many of you have been to Tomaquag before? Oh, that's a pretty good crowd. Good job. Those that haven't, you have a homework assignment to come visit us. So I actually grew up around Tomaquag Museum when it was a grassroots volunteer-run organization. My grandparents owned and operated Dovecrest Indian Restaurant, which was on the same location that we're currently on. And I had no intention, other than being a kid and kind of being around it. My mom was the one that was the volunteer director in the 70s that got the museum its 501c3. I even served on the board, but again, a volunteer organization, very grassroots. I didn't envision that that could be a job I could do when I grew up. And so when I was in school, I became a teacher, which I loved. But I went back to the board in the early 2000s and said, hey, can I open a school under your umbrella? Now, you gotta keep in mind, it's a volunteer organization that at that point was working, but it was not the organization that it is today. When volunteers could do, stuff happened, and when volunteers couldn't, nothing happened. And I think they really thought that I wouldn't get it done, but people that know me will know that I'm extremely stubborn. Some people say it's tenaciousness, I say it's straight up stubbornness. So when people tell me I can't do something, I'm bound and determined to do it, regardless of what they say. And so we opened New Each One School at Tomaquag Museum, really a reaction to the experiences that I had in school, that Native kids in this community have in school, and what my children were experiencing at the time. And so I ran that school for 7 years, from 2003 to 2010, and then the floods of 2010 came in and washed away the roads and made a lot of mayhem. And we realized as an organization that we still didn't have a strong museum because the museum was still volunteer, yet it had this like sort of wonky little program that had a lot going on and things. So through a lot of work with the Rhode Island Foundation and their expansion arts, we learned the business of nonprofits and started making shifts to create sustainability for the organization and create infrastructure. And over these, I started in 2003 and now it's 2025. Now from 2010 especially on, we now have 16 staff and 12 are full-time. We did that flip about 3 years ago to full-time staff. And it was a lot of hard work, but I want to tie that to books for a moment. One of the things that's important for Tomaquag Museum is that idea of first-person voice, whether you come through the exhibits to hear first-person voice about our history, our culture, who we are today. We also were talking, and this is going back in time again, back to that like 2003 time period, we were like, we need Native authors from this region. There wasn't a lot of Native authors, period, but what few there were not from this region. And so we kept talking about like that, and that's how Dawnland Voices happened. Siobhan Senior was a professor at UNH, and she was doing a conference, and she had a bunch of educators come to this conference, and she was looking for diversity. And so there were 3 Native educators that were from this area that got invited. Unbeknownst to her, we were all related. My last name is Spears, my mother's last name is Dove, and my aunt's last name is Wozencroft. So she had no idea that we were all related. But it was at that conference that we started talking about literature, because Siobhan is an English professor, or was an English professor, she's retired now. But and she's like, she was frustrated because she was teaching Indigenous literature, and the powers that be over her kept saying there's no Indigenous writing in the sort of Northeast region. And she's like, yes there is, yes there is. So she ended up embarking on this project that was delving into Native communities, working with Native communities, finding what I'm gonna call like the indie authors, the grassroots authors, the people that were writing news periodicals in the community. And so whether that's Narragansett Dawn, that was written in the 30s and 40s, or John Christian Hopkins, who's a Narragansett author, a published author that they had like written right out of even being a published author from this region, to new writings that could be added. So in Dawnland Voices, you have voices of young children from Nuituan School. You have a poem in there that I wrote when I was about 21, that was published originally in a curriculum project that I had done as a teacher. Well, before I was actually a teacher, but I was working for the tribe in their education department and got this amazing opportunity to do Native American curriculum. And it actually was a poem about the brook that's near us, but it was really about my cousin Sean, who had passed away, and my memory of him taking me fishing. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a bit of a chatterbox, and so I wasn't a great fishing partner, but he still brought me anyway, and so it was my memory of that. And that's probably like my first published piece of writing was in that curriculum. And then time went by, and in Dawnland Voices, I'm published a few times, and then we continued on, and we've done a variety of projects, including this book, Through Our Eyes, an Indigenous View of Mashapaug Pond, that the first edition was done with Holly Ewald and Dawn Dove and myself. I wasn't one of the editors in the first edition. In the second edition, I was the editor. But the project was done with the Native community in order to have Native voice. So there were young children's poems in the book. There were oral histories documented into the book. There were writings that we were responding to the art that we were creating around Mashapaug Pond. And so that was a very long story. But the idea is that the idea of Indigenous voice through literature was really important to us because we were absent, at least in the minds of the powers that be in the region, and because it was hidden in archives and hidden in indie book companies and other kinds of places like that, and not really visible. So one of my biggest goals was to get as many projects as we can, and truth be told, out of our staff, Silver Moon is published, Samantha is published, Crystal is published, and I'm published out of our native staff at the museum. And some of us multiple times now, and that's something that's really important to me, is to have that voice. And so, you know, when I think of Princess Redwing, who was one of the co-founders of this museum, she was a writer, she was a teacher, she was a culture bearer and putting those stories out there either orally or in writing. And even now in our archives, if you haven't looked at our belongings blog, our team uses things from the archives to spark the conversations that are in our blog. So it's a great place to learn about Indigenous writing from past times. We'll pull things out of the archives that are handwritten from people like Princess Redwing and what was going on in the community at the time, whether that's about one of our Thanksgivings or a ceremony or what have you.
I love that. And the voices piece is so important, and the sort of like decolonizing language. A thing I loved writing about, so if you're kind of not familiar with The Bone Thief, my main character is an archaeologist for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so she is called out to a wealthy kids camp in South County when some remains are found that are been tied to the Great Swamp Massacre. And then they're stolen. And it is called The Bone Thief, so like that's not too much of a spoiler. And then also there's a Narragansett teenage girl who was missing, who had connections to my main character. She was actually a bad boss, which I really enjoyed writing. And especially with interns. Like I was kind of a bad boss with some people when I was like in my character's 30. So like I can kind of remember like being, anyway, so I liked writing that thread. You know, when you like think you know everything when you're 30. I'm 44, so I wisdom now. So she's got some kind of guilt around that. And then it's all tied to a secret society, which is not based on anything real. I've had people ask me something, but it's certainly based on real stories of things done behind the scenes of, you know, clubs and secret societies and things, but not necessarily one that's based here, called the Founder Society, whose members go all the way back to the Mayflower. But one of the things I was really interested in exploring was around a term that has been decolonized for me thanks to Tomaquag, which is instead of artifacts, they're called belongings because they belong to someone. And I've had a lot of people mention that to me. I've had actually archaeologists mention, like, where is that from? And I always give Tomaquag credit. But I just think that's such an important thing, and it's really a conversation not only that I was kind of trying to figure out in this book, but it's a conversation nationally right now, internationally. If you've been following the Egyptian Museum at all, this incredible new museum, it looks so beautiful. Well, they have this beautiful new facility in Cairo, and they're saying, all right, now we want our belongings back. And they're like, Germany just said no. I just saw that on the news. Like, they're going after these things that belong in Egypt that were either bought by wealthy men when that was like the thing to do, to go around the world and grab these objects and belongings from places. And sometimes it was done above board, but often it was to, you know, in really shady circumstances. But there is this conversation, I feel like, that's happening, that's already been happening in Indigenous communities in America in particular, other communities as well, because Indigenous remains and funerary objects and just things in community were put on shelves. And if you follow NAGPRA legislation and things like that, and this idea that they should be returned, but there's just not a lot of push outside of a little, I mean, certainly not right now, other than people asking for it, people demanding it, people wondering, why are these objects still on shelves? But I think it's important, and we're so lucky because we have Tomaquag, which is decolonizing a lot of this for us. But I thought maybe it'd be interesting to, if you want to share a little bit too about that work, because it is really about voice, And when you know, not to go super specific, but like when you go to the Risky Museum and there was a mummy there, right? It's sort of like, why? And who's telling us about it? Is it someone from Egypt? Is it someone who has a connection to this person's body or to the funerary sarcophagus? Or, so it's just, my instinct while writing this book was maybe we've been doing it wrong this whole time. And I'm glad that now there are places like Tomaquag and others who can lead us, I think, in the correct way of putting those voices forward, as well as returning the objects to where they belong.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think this is something we think about a lot because a museum by its nature is a colonial structure. And so my forebears, meaning the people who started this museum before me, they were already thinking about this. And truth be told, when I became the executive director, we had no collections care policy. Not because we weren't caring for it, but because writing it is fraught. And even once I was the director, it really took us a long time. We had drafts, but the drafts made you cringe. The word choices made you cringe, the meaning behind them. And so that article that Christine mentioned that we were talking about, as we've always done, was we were practicing the decolonizing, but we didn't have it written in the policy. And then also thinking about laws and rules around museums that you have to do, like to make sure that that language is in there. So not only did we change words like belongings, but we also use words like enculturation instead of, now the other words lost my mind.
It's gone now.
It's gone forever.
You're decolonized.
It's the idea of when you're talking about someone else's history, and there's a word for that, but since I use enculturation all the time now, I can't remember what it is.
Like ethnocentrism?
Yes, ethnography.
Sorry.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
instead of that, we use the other word, and it's that kind of thing. It's trying to come up with words that mean what we mean, because we're studying about ourselves. We're not studying about somebody else. We're studying about our own selves, our own communities, our own knowledges, and things like that. And so we took a lot of pain. I mean, I could talk about this for hours, so I won't. But we took a lot of pain and detail to change word choices in our collections care. But also when we put in rules, we also put disclaimers. So for example, most collection care policies, you know, you wear the gloves and you never touch the things, and you know, box them up, and that's that until you need it for an exhibition. And we go, well, no, because the elders tell us these are living and these have a life and a breath of their own, and so therefore we have to, in an appropriate way, in an appropriate time, they sometimes need to be touched. They need to sometimes have ceremony. They need to have access to elders and things like that. So that's just a couple of quick examples of some of the things that we're doing. We're actually rereading. We did this maybe 5 or 6 years ago to finality and actually get it approved by our board. And now we're reading through it again going, did we do enough? Is there areas that we could do better? Now that we've done it once, could we think about things a little bit more deeply? And I think the point in that is it's an ever-evolving thing, that you're thinking about these concepts and constructs, and what does it mean to either, you can think of it in the negative of decolonizing, or you can think of it in the positive of indigenizing your practice. And so we're looking at those things all the time and thinking about what we can do and what can be a next step. I think in the book, they're wrestling with some of that as well. They're wrestling with whose voice it is, whose right is it, like what's going to happen to belongings. And you mentioned like going into museums and the concerns about things in Egypt, and I just wanted to say that like when I was young, I always felt those spaces felt wrong, but I couldn't articulate and even formulate in my own brain why. And when I got to be like a young adult, I was teaching in public school and I was taking kids on field trips. And then I had the aha moment that these are living beings that are deceased, that we're glorifying because we believe what they're buried in has value in an economic way, and or even in an aesthetic way. And I, like, since I was like 30 and I'm 59 now, I don't walk through those. And whenever I'm at a museum and they want to take me through that particular gallery, I make them walk me all around. Like, I'm often going to places where there's a meeting and they're like trying to cut through. I'm like, no, I think it's a disrespectful space. And when I think about it from my own perspective and how horrified I am for my ancestors, I can't do the same thing to someone else. And so I push back on that. And I think it's because we're desensitized. And, you know, as kids, we watch cartoons with fake mummies, you know, walking around and other kinds of things like that that just make them not real. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and realize they're real people, and if they were my parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, I'd be horrified if they were in a museum. And so I think as museums, we have to constantly be thinking about that. You know, we're an independent nonprofit organization, so we have to abide by NAGPRA as well, and we have to file things regarding NAGPRA. And it's complicated, and I get why especially small museums struggle with understanding those processes, but it's just our responsibility to be in communication with tribal communities because our original collection is diverse. And you know, we continue to work through that process as well. We have actually belongings from North and South America. Now, of course, the farther away we go, Eva Butler, who was one of our co-founders, she was an anthropologist, and that was what you did in that time period, you collected. And some of these things were gifted to them as well. Eva and Red Wing were gifted from other communities, and so sometimes we have these things and we don't have all the background knowledge on it. But when we can, we either repatriate through the formal process, which we have not actually had to do yet, but I've had those conversations and follow the different processes of communication. But we've also done a rematriation, and that is something from a matrilineal community we think is important. It's kind of like taking repatriation to an even higher level. On an international level, as you were just mentioning, there's no laws to enforce the rematriation or repatriation of these items, but we actually rematriated an item from Brazil that came to our doorstep from a donor that just thrust it at us on a winter afternoon and said, here, if you don't take this, we're just gonna throw it in the trash. And so, of course, we took it. It was this beautiful, we thought yoke that went around your neck from a Brazilian tribal community. And we looked it up, we found an image that was similar and so forth. And we said, well, we'll do ceremony, we'll, you know, package it up, rehouse it, and care for it. And when there's an opportunity that we can return it to where it belongs, we will, because we believe it's ceremonial for rites of passage is what we thought. Speed up 10 or more years later, and we end up partnering with Tufts University on this really amazing week-long gathering where these 5 women from various communities from Brazil come to the Boston area. We're all there, and one of the trips is also to our museum. So I say to my colleague that's with me, when we get to the museum, we're gonna show this to them. And I'm gonna try to tell this story quickly, but a tragedy happened. On one of the days when we were at the art museum in Boston, they got a phone call that someone had passed away. There's a lot of resistance happening because down in Brazil there was a lot of conquest happening. And one of the people in the resistance group was killed. And so they were really having trauma. And one of the women, the next day, when it was time to come to Tomaquag, she had put on traditional clothing. And one of the pieces was the exact thing that so we asked about it more. It was actually a headpiece and not a yoke, what we thought. And she told us about it and why she was wearing it, and it was like to help her deal with the trauma that had just happened. And we had when they got to our museum and we were talking and doing all the things, we brought out the piece, and it was like one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had. It was a lot of ceremony. It actually gives me a little bit of chills right now. A lot of ceremony, a lot of songs, a lot of dances, a lot of community happening. And it was women given to women and rematriating something that belonged to their community. And they could tell, what was really remarkable is they could tell by the style of the knot which community it belonged to. Because from my perspective, they all looked exactly the same, but they actually weren't exactly the same based on the way it's tied. And I thought, could we do more of that? Like as people, not just Tomaquag, but just in general. Because as beautiful as that piece was, we didn't even understand it because it's not from our community. And so I think the idea of returning things to where they belong, where those stories can be told, and the depth of meaning that is actually there that you just don't understand. And just because we're Indigenous doesn't mean we understand every other Indigenous country across the Americas. We just can't, or across the world for that matter.
That's beautiful. The other kind of thing I think along that thread is, part of returning belongings is fighting erasure, because part of, I think, that sort of culture, when you put something on a shelf, there's this implication in some ways, or if you take Indigenous remains, that they're more similar to a dinosaur fossil than a community. And so I think that has been sort of a real upside for writing both The Bone Thief and Blood Sisters. And there, of course, is Narragansett representation in the Widows series too, which actually Lorén helped with, and I could tell that story later, in a little more fun, campy way. So the handsome Narragansett lawyer love interest in that series. But that's fun. I love fun representation. That's very important too. But fighting erasure in fiction is kind of one of my favorite ways to do it, because it's so sneaky, because you're able to present people with what will hopefully be a page turner if I've done my job right, but they're learning, and this was true for Blood Sisters, but I'll speak to The Bone Thief, but they're learning history that I was lucky enough to learn when I moved here and started learning about the Narragansett, pre-colonial America. There's so much I did not know, and fiction is such a great opportunity to share that in a hopefully like a page-turning way. And part of the challenge, I think, in writing this book, because there is that, like, I want to fight erasure, I want to share everything I possibly learned, but you can't do that in a thriller. It has to all be connected to plot. But it was, to go back and learn, there was just I would highlight like a couple things for me. So and I would point to Our Beloved Kin by Lisa Brooks. Certainly Tomaquag and the writings that you've done and many members on your team have done were helpful too. But this, the fact that pre-colonial America, and then even sliding into boats are over, there's all these negotiations, a long expanse of time before there was necessarily big fighting in King Philip's War or the War for New England, if we're indigenizing, is how the Narragansett and the Wampanoag, they were diplomats. I mean, I just felt like that I just did not ever see it like that. Like, they were truly negotiating these incredibly complex relationships, as well as among the tribal nations, but certainly with these colonists that were just fighting to survive and stealing from the tribes to survive. And the king had his own interests. And to me, that was, even though I'm writing a thriller in 2008, I was trying to find ways to fight what felt like a little bit of erasure, that's not a part of the narrative. It's sort of like, the boats come over, and even beyond the Thanksgiving myth, a lot of people know that's not real, but just the political complexity that was navigated for such a long time, fairly successfully, was fascinating. And then the Narragansett, like the Cherokee, had matriarchal leadership in such important ways that I also felt like I didn't see, and reading books and learning about the different sachems, the female sachems, that's another thing that I really included in here because I didn't know about it, and it's so important to see that female leadership and how it was the antithesis of what was happening among the colonial troops, and certainly in our government for the most part, continuing, for a long while. But they had female leaders that were negotiating and very successfully leading their tribal communities. And the other kind of pieces, around the Great Swamp Massacre and being Cherokee from Oklahoma, a lot of people have heard of the Trail of Tears. That's a thing that's known, and the Cherokee were not the only tribe that were a part of that. But in a lot of ways for the Narragansett, it was the Great Swamp Massacre. And so, when I've been in these rooms and I'm talking to Rhode Islanders, many of them have never even heard of that. And so also sharing, in whatever way I can, that piece of history is important to kind of like fighting that erasure part. So that was more of a commentary, I guess. But, it's important, and one way to kind of go about it. But at Tomaquag, you guys also have such an incredible way of engaging about history, but also what I was trying to do too, which is communicate resiliency, and not only through the programming, but just the celebrating the powwow or the regalia. Like there's a lot to celebrate and share outside of the hard stuff that we should know as well.
Well, I think from a Tomaquag perspective, even though we have a lot of hard conversations to have, we want to try to do it in a way, I always say, that people can hear it. Because the goal isn't to make you feel bad, the goal isn't to lecture people about the history. The goal is to make entry for discussion and communication and questions and opportunity to read things. We have book club coming up in the winter, which Vanessa will be on with us as well. But they're doing 4 books over the 4 winter months. Those that haven't joined our book club, you can stay in your home and in your pajamas and hop on the Zoom, because we've been doing it that way since the pandemic, and our team likes it because we're really rural, and unless you do it in the middle of the day, nobody's coming, so it's really worked out really nicely, and people enjoy getting on with community and talking about these great books from Indigenous authors, but without having to leave their home. I think that I always laugh. One time, my grandmother, who lived to be almost 101, I had her and my mother. I'll tell you, when you're doing a presentation and they're both in the room, that's a challenge. But they were both with me, and I was doing some keynote. I remember it was at Rhode Island College, but I don't remember the context. And, I was telling difficult histories. And when we got in the car, my grandmother looked at me and she said, "You tell them off so sweetly." And I was talking about sovereignty and conquest and colonization and like everything that was happening. But I learned a long time ago, if I can say it in a certain way, people can take it in. Where, there's a lot of hurts in our community, and sometimes when people try to explain that hurt, if they're feeling, and if that hurt is right on the front, it comes off as aggressive and angry and what have you. And I think because of the experiences of being an educator, and this is how we train our team, is to try to do that. You do have to know when you have to just let it go, too. Like, some people can't hear you. We try to debunk the myths, teach the history, open people's eyes to things, but you can't always solve it for every person. Like, we've had people that come up to us, and like, I'll use an example that happened to me. I was at the State House, and I got introduced to somebody while we were standing out there to go into a hearing, and the guy was like, just got told I was Narragansett, and he was like, oh, yeah, I met the real Indians. And he went on this whole tangent about real Indians. Well, and I was like, yeah, I'm a real Indian too. I'm Narragansett and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, 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 and starts tapping my hands. I was at the real Indians. Like, in his mind, the only real Indians were in the Southwest. And in his mind, when he was visiting that museum in the Southwest and they did a performance of some sort, in his mind, that was being real. And, I was at the State House, and so I was just wearing clothes, nothing particular. I'm sure I had a certain amount of jewelry on, because I always do, but that doesn't mean, like, whatever. And he just couldn't process that unless I was in my traditional clothes, and unless I had something in his mind that fit the stereotype, he couldn't comprehend that we were Indigenous. And that doesn't matter whether people were in upstate New York or up in Oregon or wherever. He had a certain image of what that should look like, and he couldn't get past it. I'm sort of hoping when he got home and started to process what had just happened that he maybe thought, ooh, maybe I didn't do a good thing just then. But he was struggling to understand. But what I've always done is I said to my team, when those things happen to us, which is a lot of aggressions that you have to kind of swallow, you can't solve it with that person, but you can use the example with other people. And so, like, one of our young staff, in my opinion, was kind of attacked. She was told by, and I'm gonna be blunt, a white woman with black hair, that she, the white woman with black hair, looked more Indigenous than the Indigenous young woman. And that, like, is absolutely egregious, of course, but, like, she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't get past her own stereotypes of what we're supposed to look like, to not say something like that. And so that's probably one of our hardest things at the museum is as much as you want to be open and have dialogue, there are some people that don't realize how offensive they are in the things that they're saying to Indigenous people. But with that being said, I try to teach our team to take a deep breath, not respond in a negative way. And if you can't find anything to say about that, just go on to a whole new subject. Like, just move on to the next thing, because it doesn't help us or our cause if you're sort of arguing with people. And there's more people that are willing to learn and willing to listen than the few that aren't and that are really stuck in their spaces. But on the same token, if those people still stayed in the museum, hopefully they learned something. And so they might have been way over here and just didn't understand or know, and maybe they only moved that much more on the continuum, but maybe it was just enough of a little move that maybe they're like going to think about going to book club, or think about, watching a Native film, or reading up on Native people, or reading our blogs, or what have you. So it's important to have the dialogue, and it's important for people to feel like they can ask the questions. But it is interesting what people think they can say to Indigenous people. And I'm not saying we're the only sort of underserved community that happens to, but I think the stereotypes and the misconceptions and the erasure is so deep that people don't even know that they're being offensive. And that's the tricky part, because they literally just don't know. So that's what I keep telling my team. You're trying to educate. Keep it there. If you keep it there, then it keeps you from being frustrated or angry.
Yeah. I'm just going to interrupt for one sec, because I know Lorén is supporting me.
Oh, you can do questions.
It's 10 of 7.
Yes.
So
Yes. Does anybody have any